Zoom account for this event. We're very excited for this session and the panelists and speakers that we've been able to set up. We've been working on this project for a number of months, or this program, excuse me, for a number of months, and really excited. Before that, I'm going to kick it over to my colleague Austin here shortly, but had a really one open item for the COI, and that is to announce formally that we are starting a new project within hopefully the next month, and within the next week, we will see a call for volunteers come out through ACT-IAC to the community of interest. But really, it's continuing on the thread that we've done probably 2 projects in the last 5 years, but around federal hiring transformation. That's this project, and we've secured sponsorship from leaderships within USA Jobs at OPM. But we're excited. Really, the high level of the project, and there'll be more details coming out, is looking at federal hiring transformation using industry best practices from organizations, from their talent acquisition and recruitment processes that can improve the federal process, and of course take applicant and employee experience into consideration as well. So we're looking to kick that off probably mid to late May, and get a good project and a paper that would be beneficial to the government. But that's really it for open items. We're excited for the group, and I will pass it over to Austin, our programs chair, who has kind of helped lead this effort to introduce our great speakers. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Andrew. So hello, everyone. My name is Austin Crittenden, and I'm the program chair for our COI. A big thank you to everyone for attending. We have a fantastic and compelling program for you today, and I'm eager to get right into it. I want to give a quick shout out of appreciation to our fantastic program team and to our leadership team, which helped make today's meeting possible. First, I want to give a flag for upcoming events. We are planning an enjoyable event for June 17th. We are seeking to partner with the Emerging Technologies COI to feature a discussion on ethical decision-making and applying new technology, in particular AI, to workforce management. From emerging software in which applicants are interviewed on video, but not by person, by an algorithm that reads his or her facial morphology for confidence and directness, to large AI-based strategic changes, we will feature a panel discussion with experts that can help us examine the benefits and potential concerns of this new technology. So please flag June 17th and stay tuned to the calendar. We will publish details soon. So for today's fantastic discussion, here is the agenda. Each of our speakers will provide a brief 10 to 15 minute introduction featuring their unique insight on the topic. After this introduction, we will pivot to a panel discussion with our 3 experts. You in the audience will lead the direction of our conversation. Please raise your hand to ask questions for the panelists. You can do so by voice and video, or use the chat box to enter your questions. We really want to see your thoughts and questions, and we really value your input and feedback, so we really welcome it. Please do not hesitate to speak up and converse with our panelists. Regarding today's program, briefly, today's subject is COVID-19, a year's retrospective and path forward. To help provide insight on this topic, you will hear from 3 experts. The first is Professor Anna Santos Rutschman, the assistant professor for the Center of Health Law Studies at the St. Louis University and a member of the Biden administration's COVID-19 Innovation Committee. She will share her expertise and insight on mandatory vaccination policies. Second, we have Dr. Anthony Harris, who is the Chief Innovation Officer and Associate Medical Director for WorkCare, a leading physician-directed occupational health services company. And he will give very unique insight on best practices for safely returning to the office. And third, we have Rob Shriver, who is the Associate Director for Employee Services at the Office of Personnel Management. Rob will provide insight as a federal leader on the future of work for the federal workforce post-COVID, and we'll focus in particular on the data and telework changes that they are looking at OPM. Without further delay, we are honored to begin our discussion with Professor Rutschman, and we will pass it to Professor Rutschman.
All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here. As our organizers have mentioned, I'm at St. Louis University, and I work for the Center for Health Law Studies, which is the largest one in the country, but also the WEFL Center for Employment Law. So vaccination mandates are something I've been studying and accompanying for a really long time, and they've become, of course, particularly relevant during the pandemic. I'm just going to clarify one point, which is I did advise the Biden campaign and president-elect on aspects related to health law, intellectual property, etc., but I don't advise the current administration. So just clarifying that. I am going to start, and I don't know how to go back. I clicked too fast. Nancy, is there any? Thank you so much. I'm going to start to explain as a law person what's the legal basis for the mandates that we've all heard about. And then I'm going to explain that because COVID-19 vaccines came to market under particular regulatory circumstances, everything we know about mandates at this point can easily be contested. So I'll frame the legal discussion a little bit, and then I'll proceed to take some takeaways from the very quickly shifting status quo in this area. So we know to begin with, and the pandemic and what has happened, particularly with these vaccines from a regulatory perspective, has not changed anything in this area. We know that mandates are legal if they comply with a certain number of requirements. The law has been settled in this area with some updates, but it has been settled since the early 20th century. So if we're talking about state mandates, it's the police powers at stake. So states have an option to mandate vaccination. If we are talking about employers and the workplace, and this is going to apply to any type of employer, the ability to require vaccination stems from an obligation to maintain a health and safe workplace. So this is, I would characterize this as completely uncontroversial. It's something that occasionally does get challenged in court, but not on the basis of the reason for us to allow mandates and required vaccination as a general rule in the workplace. This is not to say we should mandate necessarily COVID vaccination. I'll get to there in just a second, but here we are on sure legal grounding. How does the scheme work from a legal perspective? So employers have this obligation. We see the flip side of this obligation as the ability of the employer to require vaccination. The employer has to comply with a couple of exceptions. Again, the law has been pretty settled in this area for a long time. I'm happy to talk about the minutiae of challenges in recent times about what constitutes a sincerely held religious belief or similar things, but the dynamics have been in place for a long time. So if an employer does have a sincerely held religious belief, which courts have interpreted in a relatively broad way, or if there are medical or disability related reasons which are interpreted in technical ways, but obviously in a very generous way as well, then employees do not have to get a vaccine. So if one of these exceptions applies, then the employer must do actually a two-step process. So the employer has to attempt to provide a reasonable accommodation. And this is something that happens on a spectrum. So if remote work is a possibility, that's certainly a reasonable accommodation. The pandemic underscored that. But if it's something that would result in undue hardship for the employer, then that is not required. So this is not specific to COVID-19. This is what we've known for a long time are the legal dynamics in this particular area until December 2020. 2020, the big question mark was, is this going to hold true for COVID-19 vaccines? And there was a sense, this was not addressed by courts, there's not a regulation proper. So there was a sense that there's something different about vaccination in the context of the pandemic. In the previous pandemic in 2009, we didn't get to the stage, thankfully, we're in right now. So we haven't had the modern test with newly developed vaccines to know if things would work out in exactly the same way. So something that seemingly settled these doubts was the opinion and the guidance provided by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in late December, which pretty much said we are going to treat COVID-19 vaccination as we treat any other type of vaccination for public health's sake. So what that means is that we don't see, with the EEOC, we don't see anything different about COVID vaccines, which would lead us to say they should be treated differently and that employers cannot require vaccination. So the opinion of the EEOC says that employers have the right to mandate COVID vaccination, and the dynamics that I just ran through for you apply as they would apply with flu vaccination, for instance. Now, anything coming out from the EEOC is highly persuasive, but does not have the same value as, say, court opinion or other mechanisms that we have that would require, for instance, formal rulemaking on part of the agency. So highly persuasive, but this is not the end of the conversation. And this is what brings me to the legal gray area that I think is going to be relevant. Vaccines are biopharmaceuticals. They are approved by the FDA, and the emergency use authorizations that we normally have been tested on other types of products, not on vaccines. And this is relevant because with the EUA, instead of getting your biologics license, which is what you normally get under approval, full approval from the FDA, you get this acronym here, which is now very, very popular, which does not lower the standard for safety of vaccines, but lowers the standard for the efficacy assessment. So instead of showing substantial evidence of efficacy, which is what you would in order to get a vaccine approved, the sponsors, so Pfizer, J&J, and the like, they don't get approval, they get authorization, which is a lesser permission, but they merely need to show that it is reasonable to believe that the vaccine may be effective. Now, one of the things that the EUA does, it's going to be legally the instrument that allows the government to stockpile and to start rolling out the vaccine. So it has enabled the rollouts that we're currently experiencing. But FDA has been very clear in the past that products authorized but not approved under an EUA are still held to the lesser standards. So we are going to let people choose and inform them about the regulatory status of the product, and let people choose whether they want to take it. Okay, we've had EUAs in many other areas of biotechnology. We've never had an EUA on a newly developed vaccine. We've had a vaccine EUA before, but it had not been newly developed. So this is a legal gray area that pretty much means that we don't know, I cannot tell you for certainty what a court is going to say if an employer mandates vaccination and an employee challenges that requirement. I can tell you a few things though. The first one is that I'm calling it the safest approach from a legal perspective, not from a public health perspective, because I think all of us would agree here that we want the largest possible number of people to be vaccinated. From a legal perspective, at this point, what I would advise anybody to know is that the safest thing, if your concern is to shield yourself from either challenges or possibly liability, is to not require vaccination within the context of the workplace. First, because of legal uncertainty. Again, we think, and I'll get to that in a second, we actually think that there are very good reasons to treat, as the EEOC suggested, vaccines authorized under an EUA as we would treat vaccines approved under a BLA, but this is not clear. There's no ruling in the United States saying that is the case. So if you're really operating in a risk-averse manner from a liability perspective. So legal uncertainty would dictate that no mandate should be implemented. So no required vaccination in the workplace. We've started seeing those requirements though start to appear. So I do expect a challenge in the near future. The second reason why we might consider nudging and incentivizing vaccination in the workplace, but not requiring it, has to do with vaccine hesitancy. I will not delve into this too much during the presentation proper. I'm happy to discuss this afterwards, but you see what's going on with the J&J, right? Vaccine and the levels of hesitancy, which I think are completely justified when somebody hears the words blood clots, right? These are things that we see in connection with most vaccines that have the same type of technological basis. The number of adverse events is really, really low, and it's low when compared to other health technologies, but obviously that's not how things are being perceived, and we're seeing escalating misinformation about vaccines online, and we're really worried about vaccine hesitancy, which was already a problem in the pandemic. It's called by the World Health Organization one of the top threats to global health. So pushing the idea of vaccination within the context of employment might not be exactly from a policy perspective a tool that will foster confidence in vaccines. It's going to exacerbate potentially, we think, doubt and other question marks surrounding vaccination. So usually persuasive techniques tend to play out slightly better than coercive techniques. So from a perspective of minimizing different types of risks, legal one, and the consequences of vaccine hesitancy, this is the safest approach, legally speaking. Wait for a challenge before you do anything to even know if we're going to treat vaccination here as we have treated vaccination mandates in the past. And this is more a concern that's projected into the future, but this is something we need to be mindful of. Still from a strictly legal perspective, so I did a few things with my research assistants over the past couple of weeks. We've surveyed all the legal literature on pro versus anti-mandate views by legal scholars. So the scholars that are going to be writing to courts and trying to advise them on how to decide if there is a challenge to employer mandated vaccination against COVID. And we found that a slight majority of commentators appears to be confident that EUAs should be treated as BLA, so as full approval for these purposes, particularly given the stellar safety and efficacy numbers that the vaccines have demonstrated. So the majority of legal commentators seems to think that although this is a gray area, when called to weigh in, courts are going to say they're essentially going to follow the EEOC's line of reasoning, not the traditional FDA's line of reasoning. So we see legal commentators skewed towards this is actually legal and employers can do it. If it turns out that is indeed compatible with existing legal frameworks to mandate vaccination in the workplace, then we go from a slight majority here to an overwhelming majority of commentators, and this should read employee, not employer. I apologize for that. But the overwhelming majority of commentators agrees that federal employees will be subject to the dynamics that I just listed for you, which they already are for other types of vaccination, but they also agree that this is going to extend to contractors. Again, assuming that we're confident on the legality of COVID-19 vaccination being mandated, then the majority of commentators, and I'm happy to get into the technicalities if you'd like here during the Q&A, but they agree that if we get a court to say an employer can mandate, the federal government would have a legal basis to require vaccination of contractors. And finally, I'll end with this. Should the federal government really want to mandate vaccination, and if we are on solid legal grounds, particularly if a couple of challenges do arise, they don't need to be within the context of federal employment or anything related to the federal government. We just need to solve that technicality of, is an EUA the same as full approval for these purposes? It is possible to increase legal certainty if you want to mandate vaccination by amending, for instance, the federal acquisition regulations and say we want a certification of an employee has being vaccinated against COVID-19. So again, right now, if you ask me this week, with no challenge, no weighing in from the courts, this is where we stand. This would be the most risk averse approach, so do not mandate. And even if you do at some point, do keep in mind that we want to be mindful about how that is going to be perceived. So in general, nudging approaches tend to work better than coercive approaches. But again, when in the middle of a pandemic, the legal community thinks that if there is a challenge, pro-mandate views are likely to win the day in court, and in that case, they will extend to employees and contractors. And there are ways to make that very, very explicit. So that's going to be it from me. I look forward to your questions, and I'm happy to continue also the conversation past this event. So thank you again very much.
Thank you kindly, Professor Rutschman. Next, we will have Dr. Harris provide his insight.
Excellent. Thanks everyone again for the opportunity to speak with you today. Looking forward to speaking about the clinical learns that we've experienced in the both private and public space here. So with that, we've been working with large, small, medium entities since the beginning of the pandemic, and really advising them on best practices. And that's what we'll share today in regards to what we've learned, not in totality, but what's going to persist and moving forward, what we think will be important to really pay attention to. So with jumping into the post-COVID workplace, hygiene is going to be around, right? And the emphasis on hygiene, particularly around hand hygiene, has been paramount for us getting through this pandemic, minimizing the workplace transmissions, right? And if we look at the history, 2019 data, 90% of professionals in the workplace admit to coming in with cold or flu symptoms, right? 33% always of that number, 33% always come to work, even when feeling ill. And if we back that up with another layer of data, about half of them say it's because they have too much work to do and they need to get it done. The other proportion, around 38% of them say they don't want to waste their sick days, right? So we know people are showing up sick to the workplace. And so what we've seen during the pandemic is a decline in workplace transmission of just other coronaviruses, right? The common cold, as well as the flu, obviously in part in that participation of decline was wearing of masks. But certainly once masks have been retired from our process of protection, hand hygiene is likely to stay around because that can reduce the transmission in the workplace of pathogens, particularly on fomites, right? Fomites being contaminated surfaces by up to 80 to 90%. And so we'll see that persist. Other best practices are around the mental health piece of this as well. If we look at crisis management in regards to workplace productivity, it goes a little something like this. And this is what we've seen, not just in COVID-19 pandemics, but in other crisis scenarios, right? The crisis begins at the diagram on the right here with regard to output of productivity on the vertical, time being on the horizontal, and disarray happens, which decreases our productivity of the workforce. We have a recovery stage in the response as everyone kind of rallies and gets more focused on the tasks at hand in regards to getting work done. And then we have a regression stage, and that usually comes with the notion of, you've heard COVID fatigue mentioned, right? People get sick of the measures put in place to help get them through the pandemic. Certainly the impact from a mental health standpoint is felt during this phase as well, and that can impact productivity as such. And then finally getting to a state of recovery where we're moving beyond both the physical, mental impacts back to a state of normalcy. And when we talk about this curve here in regards to crisis impact on productivity, we know that what comes next and what we've seen play out is a tremendous focus on mental health in the workplace, both again, public and private sector. We were seeing this early on in the pandemic. I mean, even in April of last year, we saw numbers of remote interventions for mental health increase threefold in some places, and in some cases rather. And we know that these type of effects from a mental health standpoint on the workforce productivity is going to last far longer than the effects, direct effects from COVID-19 from a health and wellness standpoint. To what extent? We're talking years. In some cases, 3 to 5 years, and perhaps even longer, depending on how individuals were impacted directly from COVID-19 in the workplace. So having these measures in place, focusing in on mental health interventions, as well as screening, and we'll mention that a little bit later here in the talk, is going to be paramount to getting our workforce back to the level of productivity across the board, again, both in the public and private sectors. If we look at then access to not just mental health from a remote standpoint, but through telemedicine, giving access, greater access to our workforce with other measures, metrics for health and wellness is going to be important. Obviously, we've all seen the uptick in acceptance of telemedicine in the workplace, and that is likely to continue in some way, shape, or form, right? If we look at the data around it, we know that the levels of in-person visits for healthcare systems declined dramatically with the onset of the pandemic last year. We saw then the dramatic increase of telemedicine utilization throughout the summer of last year. And then we began in the fall to see a decline, a regression, if you would, away from virtual visits back towards in-person or in clinic visits. We'll get to a sense of kind of equilibrium for the number of telemedicine visits, but certainly we're going to, in some cases, be about tenfold beyond where we would have been with acceptance of telemedicine in the workplace. And so it's going to be something that will only increase in its utilization while we seek to offer additional metrics beyond health and wellness with regard to beyond COVID-19. The coronavirus has really done some interesting things around the evasion of the immune system after recovery from COVID-19, right? If you've contracted and recovered, we know that you can be reinfected. And we bring this up because the trend behind this is an underestimation in the workplace of both those who have been affected and contracted COVID-19 in the US, but also those who are being reinfected. The US just does not have the adequate laboratory examinations, meaning sequencing of the coronavirus across the board, sufficient to quantify reinfection, right? It's only a small proportion of laboratories that are testing for COVID-19 that report for reinfection. And so we're not looking for it. And if we look at estimates of seropositivity, meaning the general population who may have had COVID-19, this data coming from CDC in collaboration with both public and private laboratories, these individuals, these samples came from individuals who provided their blood sample for other reasons, and samples were tested for COVID-19. And in some cases, like in New York here, we can see that the estimated seroprevalence was high as 22%, right? 22.5% of the population having potentially had COVID-19 in New York. And that was data from July 31st through August 11th. So what that suggests potentially is that we have a large population that have natural immunity and may experience reinfection from these variants. Now, if we look at an example of this, because what the direction we're moving towards is greater surveillance in the workplace as a best practice as a result of what we've seen of reinfections and estimates of seroprevalence. Manaus, Brazil is a great example of a population back last year estimated that 76% of the population there had contracted COVID-19 and recovered. And they saw dramatic decreases in their transmission rates, eased the social distancing measures and protection measures across the board, but only to put them back in place once spikes began, both from an infectious standpoint, hospitalizations, and deaths, because the likely scenario is the variants cause reinfection, right? And so having in place in the work setting measures to prevent infections, reinfections moving forward will be something we see most likely play out even beyond just where we're at today in terms of workplace testing. So if we look at, and this all comes down to a figure you've likely heard, reproductive number here, or not. We look at the reproductive rate or reproductive number of COVID-19, in this case, around 2.5, right? If we're looking at nationwide average, anywhere from 1.8 all the way up to 5 is what we've seen, right? And certainly with SARS-CoV-1 back in 2003, it was around 3.5, meaning 2.5 people are infected by one person on average with regard to COVID-19. And so if we use this as the basis in regards to transmission and what we learn in terms of best practice moving forward, we know that even with a level of 2.5 up to, in some cases, 5.0 in New York and Florida and California that we've seen in the data, you can still in the workplace have safe transit, meaning there's ample data to show with the precautions we have in place during this pandemic, flights are safe, right? And so we're seeing both private and public an uptick in transportation with flights as well as other means of transportation because we're not seeing transmissions happen in these settings. And we have ample data to show in multiple studies that air travel alone should not be a consideration for high risk transmission of COVID-19, and quarantine as a result should not be associated solely with air travel, right? Obviously, the behavior of individuals at their destination and in the interim should be considered on a case-by-case basis, but not based upon just the air travel. And again, multiple studies pointing to the safety, quote unquote, of air travel with regard to protecting individuals when the measures are adhered to with mask wearing and in cases of social distancing in the airports. Again, we're not seeing transmissions happen substantially. And so the workplace practice moving forward from this point is we'll continue to see increases in work travel in a safe fashion. If we're looking at then other measures that have been put in place that we believe will persist beyond COVID-19, we're talking the hierarchy of controls in regards to industrial hygiene. And if we look at and highlight a particular industrial control, hierarchy of control with industrial hygiene, we're talking mechanical separation of individuals in certain workplaces. Certainly, we've all heard about the meatpacking industry. At WorkCare, we participated in helping advise early on, March of last year, these industries, particularly in the South. And what we saw there, obviously, was putting in place measures to physically block transmissions from happening through droplets, right? We'll see this likely persist in regards to how these manufacturing processes are organized to help protect workers, not just from COVID transmissions moving forward, from the cold and flu transmissions that cost U.S. businesses billions of dollars a year. 4.4 million people on average a month are absent from workplace because of illness regarding preventable transmissions in the workplace like cold or flu. So we'll see these barriers most likely persist in some way, shape, or form so that we have a safer, more protected health status for our workforce moving forward. When we talk about additional controls that will likely persist both in the public and private sector, administrative controls are going to be key. We've seen flex work with regard to shifts be able to physically separate workers from contact with one another. That, as a result, decreases that are not, right, that reproductive rate by physically limiting contact of individuals. And so when we have these fractioning of shifts into the A shift, B shift, C shift, and so forth, we're seeing less transmissions in the workplace as a result. And as from a productivity standpoint, we've not seen tremendous impact from a loss of productivity. So again, a trend that's likely to persist moving forward beyond COVID-19. And we see some phenomena happen that has been highlighted by COVID-19 that we believe will be addressed moving forward in regards to how we protect our health, how we protect the health of our workers, And I want to highlight some of the disparities that we've seen in the workplace for protecting workers and increasing the potential for recovery in regards to absenteeism when we're talking pandemic and when we're talking transmission of preventable illness in the workplace. In this case, we're speaking to childcare being a factor, particularly for families, single mother families, and getting adequate childcare for those families to prevent them from being absent in the workplace when we have impact from a health and wellness standpoint to themselves or their family, right? And we've seen this play out dramatically in a disproportionate way in the Hispanic and Black communities. And so we know that access is something that we paid attention to. We've seen not really move the needle on, but moving forward, we're likely to see solutions that bridge that gap to allow them better access and again, help decrease absenteeism in the workplace as a result of illness thereof. And then as we wrap up here, we want to talk about macro trends around how do we overall protect our workers during COVID, and then what will persist from that methodology beyond COVID. And it really comes down to continuous monitoring, right? We all may be familiar with DMAIC approach, where you kind of rinse and repeat the process of continual process improvement. Likewise, we're going to see that around, we've seen that with COVID around monitoring the health and wellness of our workforce from a daily screen standpoint, the digital touch that we all are familiar with at this point of workers waking up in the morning, filling out a surveillance questionnaire around their symptomatology, and then getting a green screen or red screen, right? We started that back in March of last year and have done well over 10 million of these within WorkCare ourselves. And we've seen this translation now, a movement from screening for symptoms of COVID, now looking forward to, hey, what are the other preventative measures that we can put in place and still have high touch and high engagement for our workforce? That's all centered around primary preventative services, right? When we're talking about sustainability of the workforce from a health and wellness standpoint, reduction in absenteeism and presenteeism as a result of illness, these measures we have seen during COVID serve the workforce well, both in the public and private sector, and we're likely to see additional emphasis paid to worker engagement and participation around how we keep the workforce healthy and productive. Again, we know there's tremendous financial loss, there's tremendous productivity loss in the workforce as a result of preventable transmission of illness. And so these measures are likely to persist very meaningfully, even to the point of testing both locally and on site. We've seen a huge swell of on-site testing provided for COVID in particular, but now again, that acceptance has already promulgated through the workforce. Therefore, we're more likely to see the workforce acceptance of other health and wellness measures from the workplace testing perspective that allows us to now rapidly identify cold or flu symptoms and keep those workers at home. Again, going back to that metric of 90% of people in the workforce, 9 out of 10 say they show up to work sick. We now have measures to prevent that from happening. We'll see that likely persist in a meaningful way as we move forward. So I'll wrap it up here with the important piece of what we've learned around workplace testing is that speed and frequency trump accuracy, right? If we look at this chart here, it's speaking to the R0 reproductive number for different levels and different frequency in testing. And in the workplace, we've seen if you test daily, that's the maximum protection for preventing workplace illness. That's intuitive, obviously, but when we're talking about crossing the threshold of that 1.0 reproductive number, meaning we start to have spread of a particular illness, that comes at a frequency around, testing once or twice a day, right? Twice a day. And so when we talk about what's going to be the future of the workplace testing, and particularly during cold or flu season, and certainly during the next at least 5 years, we're dealing with COVID, with new strains, with new variants that we may import from other nations that don't have the vaccination levels we have. We're likely to see this continue from a testing frequency in the workplace for some time to come. So with that, we'll stop here. I'll leave the additional slides for comments and we can go back to them, but I want to be sensitive to the time and to give to my colleagues here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. That was excellent. And we will pass the baton over to Rob Shriver.
Thanks, Austin. Thanks, everybody. I'm happy to be here talking with you today. I am Rob Shriver. I am the Associate Director for Employee Services at OPM, and that means that I lead OPM's policy team, the team that works on government-wide HR policy. My second time at OPM. During the Obama administration, I served as OPM's Deputy General Counsel for Policy and also the Assistant Director for National Healthcare Operations. So I'm really pleased to be back, and I'm going to talk with you today about the issues that we are looking at in connection with emerging from the pandemic and what work looks like in the federal government. So it's great to be hearing about the legal issues around vaccines and lessons learned in how work has been proceeding throughout the pandemic. And so we're going to look here, spend a little time talking about what things might be looking like as we move past the pandemic. Go ahead to the next one, Nancy, please. So I wanted to start with just some level setting. We issued a report to Congress in February on telework that relied on data from 2019. So it gives us an interesting snapshot into what the baseline was prior to the pandemic. And so I'm going to go through a few slides here that are specific to telework, and then I'm going to broaden the discussion out to some other topics that we've been wrestling with. As I go through these telework related slides, you'll see that there's a couple of data points that are noted. One is, we've got data from agency-wide reporting, and then we supplemented that by looking at a particular pay period in September to kind of get the fullest picture. What I find interesting about this slide is that in 2019, less than half of federal employees were deemed eligible for telework, and really less than a quarter actually were teleworking. Go ahead to the next slide, please, Nancy. This shows a trend line, which I also found interesting. It actually shows that telework eligibility has slightly decreased over the last 8 years, from a high of 47% in 2012 down to 42% in 2018, and then 2019 is 39%. But then, as I mentioned, when you include that last pay period snapshot in September, it's at 42. So it has stuck around in the the low to mid 40s, and it has been on a downward trend. Again, I found that to be an interesting takeaway. Go ahead to the next one, Nancy. So while the percentage of federal workers who are eligible to telework has been trending down, the percentage who actually do telework has been trending up. So again, you can see in 2012, if you think about that previous slide, 47% of federal workers were eligible to telework. But of those who were eligible, only 29% actually were. Now, when you move to 2019, the previous slide showed that 42% of federal employees were eligible to telework, so a lower overall eligibility number. But 56% of those who are eligible actually were telework. So that's on the rise. And then you can see that reflected in the green line below, which takes the eligibility population out of it and just looks overall at the percentage of federal workers who are teleworking. And so once again, even though eligibility has gone down over the years, because of telework participation among those who are eligible has gone up, you see an overall increase in the number of and percentage of federal employees teleworking. It's still only at 22% in 2019. Go ahead to the next one, Nancy. This was one that was really interesting to me, and I would not have expected. So of those who are teleworking, we looked at their frequency, and the largest category is the situational telework. That's not surprising to me. So that means basically folks who don't have a regularly scheduled or more than one regularly scheduled teleworking day, but rather do it as situations permit. So that's been the largest category. The second largest is the one that was surprising to me. So of those who are teleworking, you know, a third to 43%, again, depending on which of the data you're looking at, are doing it for 3 or more days. So that has certainly been a change since, you know, 2012 and earlier. If you track back to the enactment of the Telework Enhancement Act. 22% only 1 to 2 days, and then a very small percentage were teleworking on a monthly basis. Go ahead, Nancy, to the next one. So another thing that we examined is whether agencies were tracking cost savings associated with telework. And by far, the biggest answer on this question is that there was an inability to track those costs. Almost half of the responses said they weren't able to track cost savings. For those who are able to track, the largest percentage is in the savings around transit and commuting costs. And then you're seeing, you know, some small numbers around office space. So maybe some agencies are decreasing their footprints. You're seeing reduced employee absences, which is interesting in light of the previous presentation. But really, my big takeaway from this slide is we've got a lot more work to do in order to track cost savings around. Okay, Nancy, go ahead to the next one. Okay, so that was the baselining that I wanted to do. Now, obviously, you know, things have changed dramatically over the last year, and though we have, you know, tens of thousands, if not more, of federal employees who have continued to show up to their workplace day to day to do the job throughout the pandemic, whether they're people at the border or food inspection facilities or other essential workers showing up, public health workers. So that's continued, and we need to acknowledge that. But we have had, obviously, large swaths of the federal government that moved to an expanded telework footing. And we also have had people that are working remotely. And there is a distinction that OPM makes between telework and remote work. Telework is generally, you know, prior to the pandemic, it was thought of as people who, you know, report to their office on a regular basis, but also are teleworking. And I think the minimum is twice a pay period to report to your office. So that's telework. Remote work is people who don't regularly report to the office and may live all over the country and are permanently, you know, working remotely. Then we have hours of work. So during the pandemic, many of us were balancing all kinds of competing requirements, right? We may have had children at home who are participating in virtual learning. We may have been caring for elders because their normal caregivers or their caregiving facility was not available. We may have had relatives with disabilities that we needed to help. All kinds of things had to be balanced. And so there has been a lot more flexibility around the specific hours in a day that lots of federal employees work. The focus was more on the results and getting the job done and less on the time of day that you're doing that work. So these are some things that happened during the pandemic. And what we are thinking about now at OPM is, what do we want to do with that going forward? Because I don't think anybody in government and very few people across the country are actually talking about just reverting back to where things were prior to the pandemic. I have heard some private sector CEOs talk about that and talk about how, the last year has been an aberration and they can't wait for it to get back to the way it was. But that's not how we're looking at it in the federal government. Things have changed and there's been a lot of lessons that have been learned. And we don't want to lose the opportunity to kind of move things forward for the federal workforce. So what does that mean? That means we need to look at our telework policies and see if they withstand, allowing expanded telework when we are outside of a federal health emergency. We have to look at remote work policies and view remote work as something that is not necessarily anymore a thing you do to retain somebody who is moving to a different part of the country and you kind of are taking extraordinary measures because this is a high performing employee that you want to retain. That's kind of the way that remote work was used in the past. And now something that's a more active part of human capital management, planning, and it's just part of your overall strategy. We need to look at our policies around hours of work, as I mentioned. There are all kinds of implications for people who are working off hours that you might not necessarily think of. There are rules in the federal government about your work schedule covering core working hours that can be defined like as 10 o'clock to 3:30 in the day. There are rules around night differential pay. So if you are working after hours in the evening, there can be questions about whether you should be getting night differential pay. There are rules around the Fair Labor Standards Act and overtime and when overtime clicks in. So, I think what federal employees have proven over the course of the pandemic is they're incredibly resilient, incredibly dedicated to the mission, and will work the time to get done what they need to get done around all of the other things that are competing for their attention. So how do we kind of take the best of that and make sure that our policies are enabling that to continue on an ongoing basis? I also have on this slide pay administration and performance management. Pay administration is really a function of some of these flexibilities that I've already mentioned. So the federal government has a locality pay-based system, and that means that there's a standard general schedule, and then the pay rates on the general schedule are supplemented to varying degrees based on where you live in the country. And traditionally, there's that program has held up because people have had to come into the office either regularly or at a minimum a couple times a pay period. And so your pay was tied to where your office is. What are we going to do now if we have large segments of the federal workforce that aren't coming into the office and that are working from around the country, and maybe they live in places where there are lower rates of pay than where their office is located, or maybe they live in places where there are higher rates of pay than where their office is located. Is the rate of pay simply determined by where the employee lives if they're a remote worker? That's what the policy is right now. But if we're envisioning an expansion of remote work and that becoming, as I mentioned, a real part of recruiting and retention strategy, do we need to take a look at those pay rules? And of course, I already mentioned issues around night differential pay and overtime pay and core hours. All of those things are issues that we're wrestling with right now. And then finally, performance management. So, performance management in the federal government has been an ongoing challenge before the pandemic occurred. And, certainly, there's kind of been enough challenges over the years with a largely in-person workforce. So then, a little over a year ago, we asked everybody to transition to the extent they could to expanded telework, which is different from a performance management perspective. And there really wasn't time to train managers or employees on how to engage in performance management in a remote world. And now, as we look forward and where we might be coming as we start to emerge from the pandemic, we may be asking managers and employees to engage in a hybrid environment where some people are in the workplace on some days and are working remotely on other days, especially as capacity limitations in federal office space and office space in general continue to be recommended by the CDC. And, for my own personal opinion as a manager, that may be the most challenging from a performance management perspective of all of those scenarios, is having the hybrid situation. So how do we equip managers to adjust to this reality with respect to performance management? And I think many of us have probably observed that some people just thrive working remotely. They have a certain personality and a way of doing work, and maybe it's the functions of the job that works really well. And other people who may do great in an office environment don't do so great with telework. So there's just a reality to that. And then I think the other thing we have to be careful about is some people don't do great in telework, and maybe they weren't doing great in the office anyway. So it's not really the telework that's the issue, it's the larger performance management issue. So I raise these topics because what we're focused on at OPM is, making sure that our guidance is flexible enough to allow agencies the discretion to continue to take advantage of these flexibilities, even when the public health emergency is over. And we are not in a position to comment or weigh in at all on when that might be. So this is not to indicate that this is imminent or coming anytime soon or anything like that. That is something that, the COVID task force and the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force, they're working on. What our job is to be prepared with our policies and with support for the agency, so that at whatever time that happens, we can make sure that our policies are facilitating ongoing flexibility and not serving as an impediment to that. So there are lots of issues that we're wrestling with. We have kind of a longer term future of work discussion underway at OPM that looks at the impact of automation and bots. It looks at people moving into and out of government, and just the way that the evolution of the economy. So that's ongoing, and we're not going to solve that in the next 6 months, but we are going to need to make sure that our policies are in place that address some of these more immediate concerns, and we're looking to do it in a way that allows us to continue those broader discussions about the future of work. So once again, this is something we're working on every day. We're working with agencies, we're working with external stakeholders, we're engaging with state and local governments, we're engaging with other governments around the globe, good government groups, talking about these issues each and every day, while on a parallel track looking more broadly at the future of work. So with that, I think I'll pause. I've been seeing several questions coming up through the chat throughout the presentation. I'm happy to weigh in on some of those, Austin. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. We will now move to our Q&A segment, and my colleague Brianna Coleman will kindly partner with me to ask questions. We have a lot of submitted questions through the chat box. Let's get through these, and then we can open up the lines as well to our participants. So to start, we have a 3-part question for you, Rob, from Denise. The first is, will OPM be putting out any new policies on telework? And will OPM be asking for any new legislation on telework? And last, does OPM have a view about which federal agency is performing best at telework?
So yeah, I mean that's what.
Did we lose Rob? Is anyone else? Is it just me?
No,
We're all
we lost.
moving.
I think so, yeah.
Oh,
We just
okay.
we just lost him.
Froze up. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So we will return to that when he joins us. Let's go to Brianna. I know you have a question for Dr. Harris.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Harris. This is from Janine. How can we most cost effectively implement daily testing? And are there any partnerships out there?
Certainly. The most cost-effective approach is going to be a digital touch, right? When we talk about the scale of working with the number of workers that you all participate with and have underneath you, definitely scaling technology and definitely doing it with a third party. Trying to do it in-house when we're talking both from the screening standpoint and then next step being, what do you do when somebody's screened positive? The real cost advantage is through partnerships as suggested in the question. And yes, there are partnerships that we participate in, that our consortium participate in terms of healthcare providers in the occupational medicine space. So happy to talk to what solutions may be best. But again, scaling technology is going to be the way forward. It's that digital front door, right? That we're really doubling down on in regards to how we partner with federal employees to help achieve some of the advantages of the daily surveillance protocols that we've seen be successful with COVID.
Wonderful. So I will ask quickly, Rob, were you able to join us? Are you back on the?
Yeah, Austin, I always love it when I'm able to provide a real world example to demonstrate things like resiliency and agility. And I appreciate that you moved right on to the next question. You'll probably hear my dog start freaking out at some point. So it's just part of the show, right?
No problem. Do you want me to repeat the question to her, or do you got it?
No, I remember it. And I hope that you heard me say that in addition to looking at our policy and regulations, we'll be considering whether to ask for legislative changes. That's part of the overall review that we're doing. And then I don't know that I can call out specifically any agencies that are doing the best at telework. I mean, I think, frankly, the federal government as a whole has done an amazing job with the pivot that they had to make without any advance notice. I think it's always fair to call out Patent and Trademark, who were revolutionaries in telework from a very early time. And we certainly are talking to our colleagues at PTO to learn about their best practices from their long history with telework and remote work that they've had.
Excellent. And you know what? I will pivot for a moment. Natalie, I see that you rose or have raised your hand. If you were with us, if you could go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually also had a question for Rob. So I know you've talked publicly at other events and kind of touched on it now about the problems that locality pay kind of poses for long-term remote work. So I was hoping you could talk some about what OPM is doing on this front and how it is helping agencies kind of plan ahead for the future of that.
Yeah, so that's one of the core policies that we're taking a look at. And, locality pay, that I'm not sure whether we are going to need to pursue legislative changes or can make regulatory changes, or whether we think that there should be any changes made at all. I can tell you that I can preview for you that one of the things that's on our minds is the way that the policy currently stands is that if you are a remote worker, meaning you don't come to the office, twice a pay period, and your duty location is your home, that's what establishes your locality pay rate. I have some concerns about leaving that totally up to where the employee may be living and what that might mean. And so I think it's a tough one. I think you have it kind of cutting both ways. You have folks that maybe can kind of unilaterally give themselves a pay increase just by moving to a different location. And maybe it's not even moving that far, depending on how close they might be to a locality boundary. But then I also worry about equity of people doing the same job. And there are challenges with remote work that maybe somebody doesn't have if they're coming into the office. So there's a lot of meat on the bone for us there. We're currently working through that, and I think that we will have some guidance in the first round that we get out on.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob. Our next question comes from Denise, and she wants to know, this is to all of the panelists, what are your thoughts on college graduates being 100% telework in their ability to learn their jobs?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Doctor.
Well, yeah, I was just going to opine in regards to, just really depends on the nature of the work. With the workforce that we serve, we have linesmen for power and distribution industry, and then we have semiconductor engineers who are designing in CAD, the next best wafer, right? And so the nature of the work, depends on or attributes to how they, in a postgraduate standpoint, are able to learn their job effectively. So we see it across the board being very specific to the nature of the work. And I think there's strong push, obviously, to increase access for remote work, much like you see in Silicon Valley. That's the norm, right? Remote work is the norm in Silicon Valley. So likewise for those jobs, federally as well as private, that are amenable to remote work, we'll see that continue. 20% is estimated, right? 20% of the workforce that shifted into remote work during this pandemic will never go back to the office, right? And so it will be, as Rob has articulated in his data, the situation of, instead of once or twice a week being remote, you're now 2 to 3 days a week being remote. And that's what some of the data out of Stanford is showing. So it will be a shift that will be permanent for sure.
And I can just contribute to that discussion. First, an anecdotal piece of evidence. I have 125 students, some of them about to graduate in a month, really. They've all pivoted to online teaching extremely well, right? They're just 15 years younger than I am, but they've pivoted really, really well. Where we are seeing some concerns that we now see reported in a much more systematic way is on the mental health side of things. If you've graduated learning primarily, at least towards the end of your education, through an online model, some of them are struggling with thinking that transition might crystallize into a remote work that is performed remotely. Some of them, and I think this is the context of working at a law school, are also concerned about how temporary the legal frameworks are going to be, because we changed everything really quickly. I think we were fantastic in the way we removed many of the long existing barriers, but keep in mind that if we're thinking about precisely needing some sort of mental health support, a lot of the reimbursement that we can guarantee under the pandemic is not necessarily what we'll be able to guarantee afterwards for telemedicine, etc., unless we make some of these changes permanent. So I sense some, and I know some studies already reporting some anxiety about doing things they're absolutely good at, but that they're taking a toll on their mental health, and I do worry about that.
I'll just add, I think this is a great question. And I have a lot of thoughts on this and concerns, not only for recent grads, but really anybody that's entering a new workplace or entering government for the first time. You know, I think back to my first job as a lawyer out of law school. And, you know, my work previously was to, you know, as a dishwasher in the dining halls in college and mowing the lawns at my high school in the summer. And so now all of a sudden I was this lawyer in this office in Washington, DC, multi-generational, diverse, and trying to figure out not just how to be a lawyer, but, you know, how to be a professional and how to be a colleague. And so I bring that to the table, as well as my experience now as a senior leader and experienced leader in government, coming into an agency that I know well because I had been there previously for 5 years, coming in virtually and doing nothing but remote work. And, you know, knowing probably 50% of the people that work for me, it's still hard. Like, it is still hard to build those relationships, those coalitions, understand the culture. It takes more work. And so I'm not saying that this is a reason not to move forward with remote work and telework and expanding those flexibilities. I'm just saying we have to be aware of this. We have to have a strategy around it. You know, we have to help people that are new to government or new to their jobs, how to acclimate. They can't just walk down the hallway and develop, you know, mentoring relationships with folks like maybe they could before. There's a lot to think about, and we've got to be conscientious about it and make sure that we're actively engaged and not just kind of going through the motions.
Now,
Sorry, I'm sharing my screen here real quick if you all can see it, just to point to some additional data around the workforce productivity. And if we look at the categories of individual tasks, managerial tasks, and then collaborative tasks, all workers in this particular survey conducted, this being in the private industry, reported increases or maintenance of productivity. Most of them increases, right, to the tune of 76 to 60% increases in productivity for those who transitioned into remote from the workplace. The only area that saw not a abundance of increase was during the collaborative tasks. So I think that's where we need to enhance our capabilities, is for these remote graduates who are going to be remote, how do we collaborate with them more effectively out the gate? Obviously, that stands for the existing workforce as well.
thank you for the insight, Dr. Harris. And we will open it up to John, who has his hand raised for a question.
Actually, more of a follow-on on the how do you onboard new people into the culture and the technology, and just the how do you get stuff done around work when you're remote from everyone else. I'm not currently, I was in USDS a couple of years ago. I'm not currently in government, just as a quick disclaimer, but I've been working this way, and I've been leading and hiring interns and new grads for a couple of decades now in private industry, all remote. And what I think is interesting is what surprised me the first time I was doing this, and I've seen it consistently over time, is the interns, back to something that Anna said earlier, the interns and junior hires, the younger generations, the millennials and Gen Zs and alphas that are coming up, this is their way of living their normal life, like video calls and smartphones and high-speed internet and using online tools is normal. And the idea of coming to an office and sitting at a desk with a plastic speakerphone on the table is not normal. And so what I found was that the interns and new hires were totally comfortable with the tools. The tools were easy. The hard part was the intentionality with mentoring from the people who are the kind of grown-ups, the seasoned adults who are already there. And a lot of organizations just kind of rely on walking the intern or the new hire around the corridor and then sort of put them in a corner somewhere and let them either wither and die or thrive, depending on their luck. And intentionally, like before someone hire, how do you interview remotely? They pre-plan that so the interviews are more like how you will work. And then when you're onboarding, how do you onboard so that you can actually onboard with people? Here's the person who's your assigned mentor. Here's the person who's going to check in that the mentor is really doing their job on the mentor and on the mentee, and make sure there's no, and have all these things pre-assigned and sorted out in advance. That intentionality is the important part. And that's what's not happened. I can't think of an example I've ever seen that happen in an office environment where people are physically beside each other. But if you do that when you're physically distributed, it works great. And I could spend the rest of the call talking about how many interns became full-time employees, became promoted, and became managers in different organizations. I've done the same. It's totally doable. The hard part is the humans who are expecting an office and who are not structured, in my opinion. Sorry, a bit of a rant, but thank you. I wanted to add that because I thought it was important to what Anna said.
Please, Professor Rutschman, did you have a follow-on to that?
No, I think that is a terrific point. And as John was speaking, I was also thinking of, Rob's insight into the PTO, which has always had this tradition of encouraging remote work. And it made me think that is a model to look at. But the thing that happens when you get to the PTO, and this is just part of the skills you need to develop, you get your legal training, right? And that's months, intensive months of exposure to the types of bonds that even you swap models and go into a remote work setting later on, you develop that very important foundational skill sets and sense of belonging to a community. So I think that expecting, as we are, an increase in the number of particularly young workers transitioning directly from a model of education that was disrupted already, or even if they've graduated recently and they're now taking advantage of enhanced opportunities in this area, I think we need collectively to start rethinking how we're welcoming them into the pipeline so that they can progress, as John was noticing. So I think there's a lot to be learned out there. If we're talking about things like security, cybersecurity related issues, I think we have models already in federal work to look at and see what they've been doing well. But I think that we need to rethink that introductory stage in anticipation of an increased influx of remote workers. Remote work cannot look like normal face-to-face work looks like after 3 months. I think that the initial package has to be rethought. How, I'm not entirely sure, but that needs to be rethought.
Fantastic. Switching gears just a little bit, to this point, we've been talking a lot about federal employees returning to the workforce and the perspective of the government, but there is a good portion of the attendees on this call who are federal contractors in private industry. And so it was interesting to hear, Professor Rutschman, that both federal employees and federal contractors are likely to be covered under the same mandatory requirements. So for you first, and then the other panelists, I'm wondering how simple is the exception process, or how different may it be for private versus federal employees? And specifically, are there going to be any special considerations that agencies should be making and thinking about when deciding when and how to bring contractors back on site?
Thank you. That's an excellent question. I use the word likely in connection with where legal commentary stands at this point. The truth, as I said, is we really don't know, right? Because we've never had vaccines authorized under this pathway. The consensus, though, seems to be that should we clear that first hurdle, the mandates then would not essentially vary in their dynamics, whether we're talking about federal employees or contractors. Is that necessarily an endorsement that we should treat both constituencies the same? I don't think it is. I think what this means is that if it is indeed true that courts will agree, and we're beginning seeing the first wave of challenges, still not within the government, but the federal government, it's been state government so far, and we're expecting one at private industry level. What I think this means is that a claim, if this is where a litigation begins, a claim brought by a contractor is probably much stronger than one brought by a federal employee. If we get a ruling at some point or some indication that courts are going to say an EUA is as good as a BLA, though there is a scenario under which the federal government gets to require from both, if the government or the agency so wishes, from both employees and contractors the same type of behavior. If the agency in question or the federal government wants to be pretty clear about its message, then some form of formal intervention, that's why I was suggesting, for instance, amending the regulations, that would be the way to go. Again, because contractors have a particular status in these legal relationships. So I would say it is unclear, but there are very good arguments if we adopt this more capacious view of mandates that says during a public health crisis, EUA raises to the level of a BLA license. If that's what we're doing, then saying we should not differentiate between contractors, there's good public health reasons not to do that. It's a nudge mechanism, will make sense. If we have a different legal basis to start with, then the distinction might be more relevant. In terms of accommodating the exemptions, again, the undue hardship is going to remain the standard. There's plenty of case law telling us, this is an undue hardship. So something that's not undue hardship, if it's possible, it's precisely telework, right? We know that that's something that everybody will say, if the work can be performed remotely. And again, in the federal government, we have sometimes a much better blueprint for what telework might mean and what you can achieve through those models, as opposed to other working environments. So if we have this framework, I think that we should not expect great departures from what we've seen, say, in the context of flu vaccination or a few other diseases, or the Army with certain other types of required vaccinations. Religious exemptions are interpreted fairly loosely at this point. It doesn't have to be a major organized religion, so there's wiggle room there for some types of claims, but they have to be sincerely held, right? So I don't expect any variation there. On the ADA side of things, same thing. So this is where we stand with the EEOC's recommendation that if, as an employer, you cannot provide the accommodation without undue hardship, we're still not encouraging you to automatically fire the worker. So the guidance is extremely clear on that, but it does open the door to that possibility, which again, we're hoping not to have to get to. So the situation as it stands, it's towards a nudge, but legally speaking, should we have a decision saying, or a strong sign saying an EUA is the same as a BLA, then contractors can also be required under current legal standards.
So thank you. So that's the legal basis of whether or not it will be allowed. Dr. Harris, Rob, do you have any opinions on whether or not it'll actually, what you think will actually happen?
So when we see what we're seeing now in terms of the private sector requirements, we're just not seeing participation of required vaccination. Certainly the framework is there, the support is there from the EEOC, but there are no takers. And I think, private industry right now is just a wait and see. We see that with universities, right, play out as well. Let's wait and see if we have enough volunteerism of vaccinations to reach herd immunity such that we can protect the majority of folk in the US. And then once we kind of get to that fall status where we have hopefully our 18 and under being vaccinated, and we get closer to seeing what that herd immunity number will look like in the fall, then we may see an uptick in required vaccinations, because at that point it may be the only means by which we reach true herd immunity in the US. So as of right now, we're not seeing a lot of takers from a corporate standpoint jump into the required category.
Yeah, all I have to add is the federal government's policy is the CDC's policy. It's encouraging everybody to get a vaccine as soon as they're eligible and to get whatever vaccine is available to them most readily. And I expect that's going to continue to be the policy.
And I will just add to that very briefly that all legal literature, we separate the should from, the could, right? So just because you can mandate vaccination, that's not necessarily the way to go. There are other types of nudges, right? This is not a nudge. This is sort of the atomic bomb from a legal perspective. And you have to think very carefully about short-term and long-term resistance to that idea and how it's going to affect next time you are interested in saying, maybe with measles vaccination, we should be having a different conversation. If there's extreme resistance right now to COVID vaccination, that will affect other discourses later on. So all the advising I've been part of to different, both in the US and I have to say in Europe, to the campaign and then to governments, that has been the message, right? Just because you have to know where you stand legally, and we don't, and it would be better if we did. That still does not mean you should reach for the most coercive type of option.
So I am extremely pleased to see how much feedback and engagement we receive from our audience. I think that speaks well to the interest and the content of our panelists, and a big thank you to our panelists for providing their insight. An enormous thank you as well to our audience and to our participants for providing very excellent points and questions and feedback. We had a number of questions that we were not able to get to in this discussion, and at Brianna's prodding, we will she will kindly help out in getting those questions to our panelists. And if they have time to be able to provide a response to those in writing, we will share that with the audience in due time so that everyone has their question addressed. So with that, I will just give an enormous thank you on behalf of the EWF COI to our panelists and audience. And I will give the last minute or so here if our team, the EWF team, or if our panelists have any closing thoughts, please feel free to share them. Otherwise, we will close up the shop.
Just want to say thank you for the opportunity.
Great content, and appreciate your expertise. We could have gone for 3 hours. Still not got to every question, but no, it was fantastic. And if any of those unanswered questions we could get to, that'd be great. But thank you for your time on behalf of the entire team.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all. We will follow up by email.
Thank you.
Thanks and have a great day.